Welcome to Storytimer. Anne Kline. Anne Kline was born Ann Miller in Pennsylvania. She was the oldest of her siblings, and they grew up on a farm. She finished high school and college there. Anne earned a degree in business education. She and her husband moved to Indiana for jobs at Alcoa. They settled down to a quiet life in Newburgh, Indiana. In 1970, she left the accounting department at Alcoa to teach business math courses at Lockyer Business College in Evansville. In 1973, they were considering starting a family. They were looking forward to all that 1973 might bring their way. The old Vanderburgh County Courthouse is a stately old building in downtown Evansville. It was constructed in 1891 and remained an active courthouse until 1968. Costly repairs and a growing community made a new modern courthouse a necessity. But the beautiful Beaux-Arts style building was much loved by the community, and efforts were made to save it. In 1973, Lockyer Business College had set up temporary classrooms in the old Evansville courthouse due to a fire at their main school building the year before. Mrs. Anne Kline, a 26-year-old business, math, and accounting teacher, had finished a class and was alone in her basement classroom. Just after 3 p.m. on January 18, 1973, Anne Kline had just met with a student. As he was walking up the stairs, he heard screaming, but assumed it was just students horsing around. The screaming was actually Anne being murdered. Anne was stabbed 19 times in the chest in an adjacent alcove close to the nearest exit on January 18, 1973. She bled to death within just a few minutes. She was very near the exit. Was she fleeing from her attacker? Her purse was still in the classroom. Her jewelry was left on her body. Robbery was not a motive here. She had not been raped. Killing for the sake of killing seems to be the motive. Perhaps she was in the process of an attempted abduction. Perhaps the killer was attempting to get her to walk out with him when she decided to scream and fight back, and then he stabbed her in fear of being discovered. Anne was stabbed 19 times. 19 stab wounds allows for a lot of chances for the killer to cut himself on a slippery knife. Did he leave any of his own blood on the dress of the victim? She was described in newspaper articles as wearing a blue dress with orange and yellow flowers. News articles also described investigators looking into the fingernails of Anne and scrapings underneath the nails. Did they save that evidence? Could it still reveal the DNA of the killer? At the time, they were trying to determine the skin color of the killer. They were unable to do so. Anne also had hair and lint clutched in her hand. The hair was determined at the time to be her own. No one saw a blood-covered suspect leaving the site. There were no footprints showing which way he left. One would guess that he simply left through the closest doors there on 5th Street, on that side of the building. Was that area fairly deserted around 3 p.m. in January? It's not rush hour in the morning or in the evening. It's not lunchtime. It might have been very easy to walk right out to a parked car on the street. That exit led out to 5th Street, or a person could easily make their way left or right to Vine Street or Covert Street. Who is a likely suspect here? Robbery was not the motive. Anne didn't have any known enemies. Who was killing people just for the sake of killing people around Evansville in 1973? I think Jeffrey Lynn Hand could be a very likely possible suspect. Jeffrey Lynn Hand was working in Evansville sporadically in early 1973. I don't know where he was working in January. He sometimes did construction work. Were there any projects in or around the courthouse that he could have been working on? It is very likely. The old jail nearby was being renovated by Gregory Wolfe. He had signed a lease of $1 per year in 1972 with the provision that he renovate the building. He taught photography and planned to open an art gallery there. Students of his were volunteering to scrape paint and do other work in the old jail. Other restoration projects were happening inside the courthouse itself. The Conrad Baker Foundation was in charge of the upkeep and restoration of the courthouse property. In February and March, Jeffrey Lynn Hand worked at Whirlpool before he was fired. He also worked at Cook and Sons in May, June, and was fired from there as well. But where was he on January 18, 1973? Well, we know where Hand was on September 15, 1972. He killed Indiana State University student Pamela Milam that day. Her murder investigation would be cold for decades until Parabon Nanolabs solved it through DNA analysis in 2019. Jeffrey Lynn Hand's sons graciously agreed to give samples of their DNA so that the Milam family might gain some small measure of closure after all these years. In June of 1973, we know where Hand was again. He stabbed and shot a man to death and kidnapped the young man's wife. The murder of Jeffrey Wayne Thomas was incredibly brutal and senseless. His hands were tied behind his back, and he was shot in the face with a .22 caliber weapon. He was stabbed 8 times in the chest. Finally, his throat was slashed and his jugular vein was severed. His wife, Carol Thomas, was lucky to escape with her life. Robbery was also not a motive here. The Thomas couple only had $1.11 on them at the time. They were hitchhiking because they did not have any money. Hand was sentenced to a mental institution for that murder. In August of 1976, he was released on a technicality. Did Hand commit other crimes between these 2 murders in September of 1972 and June of 1973? It's entirely possible. Does a person who is capable of murdering strangers in such brutal ways simply stop murdering people? The timing and proximity of Anne Kline's murder to Hand's working in and around Evansville is noteworthy. Who was Jeffrey Lynn Hand? Jeffrey Lynn Hand attended Washington High School in Washington, Indiana, and graduated in 1967. He married a 15-year-old girl that year. By 1969, they had split up and each remarried other people. He served in the Air Force in Vietnam as an airman first class. I have not found the years or time that he served. He was back in the United States sometime in 72. We know without a doubt that in September of 1972 he abducted, raped, and murdered Pamela Milam in Terre Haute, after all. He tied her up and put an excessive amount of tape over her nose and mouth and left her in the trunk of her car. He parked the car back in the campus of Indiana State University. Her father found her there after her roommate and friends became concerned when she was missing. In 2019, as we mentioned, Parabon Nanolabs used DNA technology to identify her killer as Jeffrey Lynn Hand. He's also suspected of murdering Vicki Lynn Harrell of Bloomington in August of 1972. She was found outside McCormick's Creek State Park. She had been raped, stabbed, and strangled, and had what somewhat looked like the letters K and N carved into her chest. She was nude and face down in a puddle. Her murder has never been solved. He is also suspected in the murder of Linda Sue Ferry in Lafayette in August of 1977. She was strangled and left in the trunk of her car, very similarly to Pamela Milam. If he is guilty of these suspected murders in a string of college towns, could he have been cruising for victims in college towns or college buildings where he would have an abundance of young women to choose from? Think about the atmosphere of a college. Any young person in 1973 could just go and hang out on campus. You could walk into nearly any building. A person could hang around a campus building without appearing to loiter. You'd look like a student just killing time between classes. They might look like they were simply waiting for a friend. Colleges and college towns were a preferred hunting ground for Ted Bundy. I think that Jeffrey Lynn Hand also had a preference for this particular setting. If Hand is guilty of these college town murders, he drove around a lot. Do we have any record of Hand driving around for no real reason? Well, in the summer of 1973, he picked up the Thomases. They were newlyweds hitchhiking back from Chicago, where they had visited friends and family. They lived in Evansville. Jeffrey Hand picked them up south of Terre Haute. He had just recently been fired from 2 different Evansville jobs at that point. What was he doing in Terre Haute? He had 2 different handguns and a 9-inch knife with him. He had 2 different cars at his home. Why was that? He can't hold a job, but there are 2 cars there on a farm in Gibson County where he was living. Anne Kline could have been a victim of Jeffrey Lynn Hand. But the 1970s saw a huge rise in violent crime. It also could have been a lot of people. Hopefully, evidence has been preserved in this case. There are 19 chances that the killer cut himself on a slippery knife while inflicting 19 stab wounds. Was Anne's dress preserved? Can a DNA profile of her killer be found? If you have information about the murder of Anne Kline, please call the Evansville, Indiana Police Department Adult Investigations Unit at 812-436-7979. Rest in peace, Anne Kline.